economic reset, we started yesterday by looking at what's it going to take to get an economic reset in our nation. And we started with some fundamentals. We started with what we believe we see in the Word of God, that it starts from the internal to the external, that God needs to first, then needs to be an economic reset of the heart. And so what in a sense we're doing is putting some of those big building blocks in place. But Arno is a doctor. He holds a doctoral degree in economics. His specific area of focus is inclusive economics, which I'm very excited to hear more about today. He's a speaker, he's an activator, and he's a kingdom nation builder. Dr. Arno, it's so great to have you with us. We appreciate your time. You know, Lasiba and I were just reflecting on the state of the economy, on how the markets are like different to the economy. But at the end of the day, for South Africa to get out of the hole that we seem to be in right now with a 16% contraction in the second quarter on GDP, we're going to need something quite special. We know that one of your specialities, we did this in the introduction, is something called inclusive economics or an inclusive economy. Would you mind taking, 15, 20 minutes, just telling us what you mean by that? And thank you for joining us.
Dorian, thank you so much. Lasiba, wonderful to join everybody here. It's a privilege to share a bit more on this, Dorian. And yeah, indeed, a lot of questions, especially now with the economic reset, are being asked. So I think a lot of people are seeing this also as an opportunity to address many of the concerns we had even before the COVIDs and the financial crises. So can I just share my screen quickly?
You should be able to, Arno.
Love to just share slides that I have. Right, then. Can you see that?
We can see that, but it's still in, it's not in prison.
Let me just, good, better?
Perfect.
Right, okay. So as you can see, I think with the economic reset, a lot of energy is going into the recovery aspects, and we want to restore what we lost. But I think the real thinking is about rethinking our economic models. So I just want to quickly start with a bit of focus on the crisis that capitalism actually is experiencing. And very few people realize, especially if you're not digging into the research about the current new liberal framework that we've got, especially since the 1990s, which has been very market driven, and we all love markets and a free market system, but it has led to a lot of deregulation and also a lot of risks due to globalization. So on the left there, what you can see is the picture of the gap between rich and poor. Now people, I don't know if you know, but we are at a stage where 90% of the world's resources are consumed by 10% of the world's people. And 10% of the world's resources are consumed by 90% of the world's people. So that just tells you this 90-10 gap between rich and poor is an extremely dangerous situation in terms of it's unsustainable. The COVID situation and the whole lockdown has exacerbated that, and the risks are increasing tremendously. With that, we are in a debt crisis as well, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm not going to go into all the detail. We might go in the discussions, but now interest rates are low, but the risk is that a lot of people incur new debt and interest rates starts rising as inflation starts rising, and that leads to a situation where people get into debt traps. So it's really a time to be cautious, but we need to address the issue of debt, because from a biblical perspective, we know debt means economic enslavement. And that's not where we would want our economic stimulation to come from. Then another issue is the issue of perverse growth. And this is the problem that in this super capitalism society, that we have maldistribution of resources, which re-emphasize the global inequality problems. And the moment you've got maldistribution, it means your economy is not functioning as it should. And many of the reasons for the lack of growth has to do with the distribution of resources. And then the whole question is, so if we're unhappy with capitalism, should we move towards socialism? What we see in America with people, riots in the streets all around the world, more and more people are taking to the streets and showing their dissatisfaction, but the youth even are calling for socialism to take effect. And people, this is very dangerous because the answer to capitalism's problems is not Marxist thinking and socialism, because socialism is centralized control, especially where government controls it. So we need to come up with alternatives that does not restrict us in terms of our options. So I hope you can see, because I need to move the icon around a little bit. At the bottom, yeah, what I've just written there is, this just points to one thing, that we need structural and systemic changes to the economy. So with other words, at the roots of the economy, we need drastic change in terms of how to remodel our economic frameworks, especially in an African context. Because if you do a lot of research, you will see that the Western capitalist model is not as effective as it should be in a pluralistic, collectivistic African context. And Africa is lagging behind. If you look at the global growth projections, even the effect of globalization, Africa has largely been excluded and marginalized, which is part of the effect of inequality. Inequality excludes. So the question we need to ask is, what do we have as Africans to bring to the economy that's different than what's in the Western model? So there, the concept of Ubuntu, and especially the concept of Ubuntu economics, is extremely relevant, because people, Ubuntu in Africa, there's a lot of definitions, but it boils down to the goodwill of the people, where there is really a collectivistic commitment towards the greater good of the other person. So if we apply those principles in an economic context, what would that look like? It's even kingdom principles that we should apply. If we look throughout the Word of God, whether it was Joseph in Egypt, whether it was the Acts Church, how they provided for each other, Ubuntu is reflected there. And the whole concept of caring for each other, you know, rather than simply just profit making, is part of the new thinking. So the African DNA is so receptive of kingdom principles in economics. And this is where we need to bring the match, which will make Africa unique, and also, I believe, unlock the hidden potential economically in Africa. So the one suggestion that has come through, and it's economics, we talk about heterodox economic frameworks, and this is inclusive economics or economic inclusivity. And I believe this is where this is the direction in which we need to make the change. So what you can see there from even just the picture there is the whole comparison between industrialized model on the left and society, people-centered model on the right. So what is very significant there is that it speaks of collective well-being being the main concern, and that the main focus area, and not just profit making. The economy, there needs to be profit making. You need businesses to be successful, but you need to ask for what purpose. Is it just about wealth creation, or is it about collective well-being? There, the concepts of inclusive business comes into the picture. Conscientious business, corporate, not just corporate social responsibility, but corporations may be adopting communities and making a real tangible contribution there in communities. So in that sense, you bring the private sector and the civil society closer to each other, and you have the government to support that through policy making and local economic development. We're talking about a caring economy. We talk about balanced progress, definitely progress. We need to move economically ahead, but is progress only about more money in your pocket, disposable income, or is progress about the better quality of life? If you look at that picture and you compare the left with the right, I mean, it's obvious which is better in terms of quality of life. But the irony is, on the left, a few people are making huge amounts of money, whereas on the right, you have community principles, biblical principles, and you have a caring model for the environment, for people, and for the businesses. It's not excluding the centrality of profit making. So, the new TINA, and you would remember that concept comes from Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. TINA stands for there is no alternative, is sustainability. If we don't move towards economic sustainability within the next 10 years or so, we are going to miss the boat in terms of, rethinking our economic model, because it's like a steam train heading in a direction and we are completely uncertain because it's just becoming more and more unsustainable. So what is kingdom economic thinking? How does kingdom thinking contribute? I've just highlighted a few. There's a lot more. So number one, we have a moral obligation. That's where the caring economy is based, and it's values driven in our profit making. With other words, it's not just about the I, the me, and the self-serving. It's the us, the we, and the serving the community. So if you have a public corporation, it's in the interest of the public. And what does that mean in a society context? Then social justice, creating new opportunities for the poor. There needs to be a collective commitment by everybody in a community towards creating those opportunities for the poor, not just, as we know, giving the poor person the fish, but teaching them how to catch the fish, the skills development. And then collective responsibility taking. It's not just about one or two that's doing everything. The biblical model is that you need to be productive. Even if you look throughout history, Calvinism and all of those principles that have been implemented in society, Switzerland, for instance, what made those economies unlock is the hard-working, characteristic in the people to be very productive. And then healing communities. If the economy is not bringing healing in the communities, we are missing the boat. This is where we need to ask questions about what's the purpose of the economy. Now, on the right there, you'll see the concept oikonomos. Now, that was the very first word for economics. It's a Greek word, and it means the management of the household. So what inclusive economics is doing is it's taking the original concept of economics, oikonomos, back to where it came from in terms of it's about managing the resources. So not just the household, but the community, and not just the community, but the economy. And one would think that the government plays a big role in managing the resources. The fact is, very often governments are self-serving, corporations are self-serving. So who's looking really after the economy? So it's a collective commitment by stakeholders to manage the resources well, so that there's a fair distribution. And then, of course, we know that when God created the earth, he created abundance. When I taught my first year economics students that the economy is based on scarcity, and that's the driving force. It's correct in a worldly context. But the truth is, God has given us abundance. So we need to operate from an abundance framework and say, how do we best distribute this? Right. So let me just quickly deal with the criteria for economic inclusivity, because this is very important in terms of understanding the concept. So number one, we talk about inclusive growth. So economic growth, but it must be inclusive. What does that mean? Growth that not only creates new economic opportunities, but also one that ensures equal access. The word access is important to opportunities created in all segments of society, especially the poor. So all segments means whether it's in education, whether it's in business, whether it's in media, the emphasis is in all elements of society. new opportunities being created for the purpose of including more people in productive processes. So the one concept we talk about is pro-poor growth. Now in economics, we talk about in relative or absolute terms. With other words, not just about reducing poverty, but also about ensuring that poor people's income grow faster than rich people, so that that income gap is reduced. Then you've got pro-poor growth. Broad-based growth involving more of the poor in the growth process. So a commitment to involve the poor in that aspect, and not just at the end and hoping for a trickle-down effect and for the poor to benefit as a hope. No, it must be intentional. Shared growth is the next one. Greater access to non-income aspects of well-being. There's a lot of, for instance, how mums that stay at home, that work from home, they don't earn an income for doing that, but they are not recognized in the economy. So how do we create a model that recognizes the non-income aspects? Because that contributes to the well-being of society. And when society needs to decide, how do we reward that? How do we build incentives for that and make sure? Because the well-being is very often determined by the small things. That's not always the profit incentive. And then, of course, green growth, looking after our natural resources, being environmentally responsible. So the second criteria is moving towards a circular economy. Now, people, one of the crises we have in our current economic framework with new liberal capitalism is that we have a linear model where you've got inputs and outputs, and you hope for profits at the end, and you hope it will benefit most people. Now, that linear model has a lot of wastage and a lot of ineffectiveness, and a lot of things that are not economically stimulating, a high wastage level. So we need to move towards a circular model where we learn to reuse much of our economies. With other words, if we look at a supply chain, how can we lengthen the supply chain even in its secondary phase? With other words, when products have been delivered, how do we recycle those products? Or they talk about the concept of upcycling, involving more people, for instance, the poor and the unemployment, in the process of recycling products. That would help with the environmental impact and also job creation. And then we need to develop those models for stimulating the economy. For instance, the whole eco-bricks concept, it's an excellent example of how people in community take 500 milliliter water bottles and they stuff it full of plastic bags, small broken plastic pieces. It solves the plastic problem, which is a major thing globally. And also those bricks are so strong that it can be used to build small houses or even make gardens, beautification of that, and use it in communities. So we need to think differently about using our resources, because we lack running out of capacity, natural capacity. So the next one is what we call genuine economic progress. Now, people, this is a brilliant initiative that has occurred in the last number of years, where we all know GDP, gross domestic product, is used to measure economic growth. When we talk about economic progress, genuine economic progress, I ended here by just highlighting that this GPI is a complementary indicator to the GDP. The GDP we all know very well. And maybe I should just say something on the graph. This is the GPI GDP comparison that you see on the top right there for within the US. And what you can see there is, although GDP grew, GPI actually decreased. With other words, in genuine terms, they actually decreased. So how you measure that, and that's just the formula that is being used, that's below the graph, that you can see the GPI, it's equal to the consumption adjusted for inequality. So they use the indicators that you see in that framework, that circle, about 25 indicators, and they use whichever ones are related to each one of the variables in the formula. So consumption adjusted for inequality plus government expenditure on non-defensive. For instance, schools, hospitals are your non-defensive government expenditure, and then minus any contribution to welfare, especially non-monetized contribution. And then minus the D there is basically a private defensive expenditure, like insurance. It's a private expenditure, but it's a defensive one in terms of your family, or medical insurance, or and so on. So, and then minus also the expenditure on or the environmental costs, and then minus the natural base erosion. With other words, non-renewable energy, for instance. So just to give you an idea, these are much better indicators of welfare in society. And these are the things we need to start using, because once you identify the problems or the focus areas in more detail, you can address them. For instance, you would pick up on the social side, crime, family breakdown, divorces, for instance. These things affect family stability and the productivity of families. So this is an opportunity, especially for Christians, to start playing a much more intensive role in the economy. Even if you don't have the economic skills, your biblical worldview already enables you. So moving to the fourth criteria, we are busy with the criteria for economic inclusivity. The fourth one is building a collaborative economy. So one model that was developed was by, what's his name, Jeremiah Owang, and he developed the honeycomb model, just suggesting, and I'm not going to go through everything, that we should be thinking of collaborative economies, sharing economies, and so on. For instance, the whole Airbnb is an example of new thinking in the economy. Uber, for instance, Uber Foods, where consumers become producers using their resources. So with other words, people realize that I, as a consumer, can use what I have, I can share it, and then provide more access to people to the economy. The young generation coming through, many of them don't even want to own cars because ownership is a burden. I mean, it needs to be serviced, there's insurance costs, all kinds of things. But if they can be part of an access economy where they have transport available without the burden of ownership, that's a better situation. So as you can see, a lot of emphasis on access and creating integration within the economies. And a honeycomb model is based on that industries come closer in terms of supporting one another in building a collaborative economy. And then the fifth one is inclusive economic policies. And I just want to say a few things here. So a big thing about the policies, of course, brilliant policies, but too much political interference and too much or not execution, not implementation, you know. So the big thing about the problem, apart from the fact that there are corruption problems and political issues, is the fact that there's no partnership between government and society to create an enabling environment. Because if that is the goal, then society will take hands with government, and even corporates, the private sector, will come on board and say, listen, what are the critical things in our community where our company is based? Let's start working together. And then you create that enabling environment, and that builds the capacity. Distribution is another thing. We talked about the concept of oikonomos, the distribution of resources. So the big problem is that you've got so much wastage in the economy. I mean, think about restaurants throwing away food, supermarkets throwing away food. That is actually, some of that can be, should be available to the poor, but there's no distribution networks, for instance. So this is an area where some businesses can see an opportunity and say, listen, let's work on the better distribution of resources and reduce the wastage. And through that, we empower the people. Just on tax reform, something that I picked up in Professor Fioramonti's book that I think is really brilliant, The Well-Being Economy. And he mentioned something about developing a system of smart redistribution. Let me just quickly explain the concept. What he says is that if you can create a transparent system where people can see where their taxes are being spent on. In other words, you pay your taxes, but there's a tracking mechanism. I mean, we've got the technology that you can exactly see the amount of taxes, where it goes. Is it being spent on children for schooling, for hospitals? That would create such an incentive. That would fulfill the purpose of tax, where you actually see the impact of what you pay. And so in that sense, it can even create opportunities where those who pay taxes, especially the high end of income, can get more involved in those households and maybe offer to pay for the children's, varsities, or education costs. And that would provide an incentive for a collaborative economy in our thinking. And then the government's role would be to manage the options to which people can spend. So in other words, the government can communicate and say, listen, these are the 10 primary areas, education, public services, etc. And each one, as they are filled up, then people's choices have to change and they can just contribute to other areas. So it would be a way where people have more power in terms of decision making. And that is what the inclusive economy essentially is. If we want to unlock the capacity in communities, remember, there are many dormant capacity. People, even if you drive past an area where there's just shacks, there are people there. And as Christians, we value people more than anything else. There are capacity there that's lying there. So with the inclusive model, we can unlock the local capacity. Because remember, whereas the current framework is a bottoms-down approach, where those at the top, they get the biggest part of the cake of the economy, and they hope for a trickle-down effect. The inclusive model is a bottoms-up approach, where you address the needs in community, and those needs open up markets for service delivery and local, and the people, as the needs are being met, they start, supporting that, and it becomes financially viable. So there's lots of capacity. Let me just highlight this and say, I believe God's heart for the economy is decentralization. With other words, empowering the people. If you look at the Acts model, it was based on decentralization. It wasn't based on, government centralized control. If you look at, for instance, the figure on the right of the screen there, you'll see that the centralized model is everything is built around the state and multinational corporation, wherever money is centralized. And decentralized is a network model where we collaborate, where we bring in alternative economies, where we extend the value chain after service delivery or product delivery, in terms of reuse and in terms of renewing the economy and the capacity. So in that sense, I think this is the big challenge. You change a system by changing the values. So in our context, the key thing is moving from self-interest to shared interest. And this fits into the Ubuntu economic framework. The African mindset is ready for this, because the natural African inclination is towards, what about my people, my community, my family? So can't we build the economic model around those principles? And that would capacitate people in their families, in their communities, to become much more productive. For instance, the big success of the Japanese, even the Indian and the Chinese, has been family businesses, the Suzuki family, the Mitsubishi family, where you don't just earn a salary, but you get shares each month as part of ownership, in that family and in that business. So imagine that in a community context where you've got common property and common assets, And as community members contribute, there's a collective sharing of those. Those are resource economy models that I think we are desperately in need of. And the key is to implement that at local level, because at local level, people know each other, they know the needs, and they all want to contribute. They don't always know how. We think always of long-term education, but there are short-term options available in order to build capacity quickly. I mean, for instance, there's this whole emphasis on universities and degrees and all of that. But we need boilermakers. We need those who can, do the practical jobs in the communities, So I think it's a whole new thing, rethink of economic capacity, how to build it, and then how to connect that capacity that's needed. Because not just profit incentives should drive the economy, but collective incentives, that which is best for the people. And of course, we need to make the profits. And I think when companies, your private sector, see the value of this, that's where the unlocking happens. So yeah, it's about changing the thinking. Thank you, Dorian.
Arno, thank you. It has been absolutely inspiring, and I'm so pleased that we were able to kind of get you back to wrap up what you were saying. The one comment that we made, and I'd like to test this with you, Arno, is this concept of inclusive economics. It feels to me like it's taking the best out of capitalism. In other words, the incentivization, the profits, to kind of build and develop, but it's taking the best out of socialism, this sharing, this caring, this, thinking we, not me. Is that really what you had in mind when you were developing this concept?
Dorian, yes and no. Definitely the best of capitalism, because we need a free market system. Look, the Chinese, for instance, have a hybrid model of, they still have socialism, but they brought in a market model and combined it. It's generating growth, but the people's well-being are not improving. So it's not about combining. It's really about taking a step up, a level above that, because these are two competing forces. Yes. The thing about socialism, although it might be well intended, it always ends up in centralized control, either by the government or whoever is in power. So we, even communism, we know. But I think this falls into the framework of not communism, but communalism, collectivistic economies. So you take from the societal emphasis, the people first emphasis, and you take from the productivity side and the profitability from the capitalist side. So it's not a combination or not taking best of both. It's really shaping something new that I believe is God's heart. But I agree with you. Yes, you tend to take some of the elements, but I think it would be a bit misguided to say it's something of the best of both, or where that circles overlaps. It's not really that, because they are contradictory ideologies, and it's important that we distinguish and say, listen, it's new, it's different, in the sense that it empowers people through economic productivity.
Arno, thank you for clarifying. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it's got the heart of what socialism was hoping to achieve, but failed dismally at.
Yes.
But yet it's got the free market principles. I've heard terms like conscious capitalism, but I think you're inclusive. Dennis Peacock used the term choice-based economics on Wednesday evening, which I think just resonates. And I think there might be a piece of work there to try and see how these new terms are kind of overlap.
The thing is, Dorian, if I can just comment, I think everybody has bits and pieces of this puzzle. We all sense it's a different DNA, this new kind of economy that we sense is God's heart. And what Dennis said, and I like that, is an army of decision makers. Yes. People are empowered when they can make more decisions. I mean, the definition of wealth is to have more options, and that's exactly it. But those options should not always depend on profits or, certain market mechanisms. It should depend on the community's involvement. The question is just, how do we get communities constructively involved in the economy?
Thank you, Arno. Now, Kagela had his hand up, but he has gone off video. Kagela, if you do have a question for Prof. Arno van Niekerk, please go ahead, my brother. I think you're on mute.
Hey, Prof, thank you very much. This is great stuff. We needed this centuries ago. Where were you? Yeah. Prof, I was just thinking as you were sharing with us here that the model that you were describing and how you showed us, I've read something about, I have a book that there was reading this, I think it was during the formation of the nation of Israel. They had what they call the kibbutz. Is it something like that? Is it something maybe similar to that, if you are aware of that?
Yes, thank you so much, Kagele. Well, I wouldn't say a full yes, but it has characteristics of it. I had a look at the kibbutz, and the thing there, it's an example, a micro level example of communalism and this collectivistic mindset, but it's still not, how can I say, systemic enough. In other words, part of the essence of those economies. It's something that's on the fringe. Now, I know if you want to build a new culture, very often you have to build a subculture outside that, and it draws the new culture over. So, the way I see this unfold is literally in communities all across South Africa and Africa, small, what we call smart villages that we start putting together. Joseph storehouses, for instance, in George, in South Africa, the people there have a Joseph storehouse where people, the poor, can have receive food, clothing, and what's needed, and the business community keeps that alive. But they also then, that's a way to attract the people, and when they're there, they say, okay, how can we help you? What skills can we develop? And then they focus on the person. So these are all, I think, puzzle pieces and elements, but it needs to come to a more integrated systemic level. And I think that's what God is preparing. And just to say, I am going to start writing a book on inclusive economics that's going to go into much more detail on this, because I believe it will be a handbook for Africa's economy.
Arno, this is so exciting. You mentioned George. Are you seeing any communities that are running with these principles and starting to see some of this creating a momentum of itself?
Dorian, thank you. Yeah, indeed, I see it's incredible to see on small scale, larger scale, people are starting to do this. In Vicksburg, for instance, is another example. I've just had a whole 2 days spending with people in Wellington. That's the other side. How quickly do the people pick this up and sense the value of this? And the response was tremendous. And we had to make sure it was multicultural, multiracial, because it's not just about Wellington, it's about Paarl and also the community surrounding that. And it was amazing how the moment people saw, but here's an alternative, here's something that makes sense and puts people at the center of this. Immediately, we started to speak about how can some of this be implemented. So not only are there examples of this around the country, for me, it's important to just see how quickly people on ground level pick this up and want to run with it. So yeah, there are lots of stories, even in KZN, there are examples, and some of these smart villages in Gauteng that has been set up already, where they brought in, built self-sustainable communities, and where they capacitate the people. There's also a number of lifestyle farms, like the one in Vicksburg. It's a lifestyle farm where they use the farming space, but they develop skills there. They build a market there. They connect with the local economy, and it's really beautiful. And for me, the biggest thing is it really resonates with the people of Africa. That this is something they feel that, it's the focus is correct. It's not this, strange system that just, and also another thing I might just add is community banks that we've set up in some communities. And suddenly people are saving money. They are building wealth in those communities, because in a community, the key is to circulate the funds, the money. That's how you build wealth in a community, and not let the money escape or drain through to other communities, and you draw it in from other communities. So, once you have those structures in place, you can really set up amazing and unlock the potential, because the people are suddenly taking responsibility for their towns.
Oh no, that's super exciting. So I know that on this, we still have 40 people that are here and participating in this. And I know there's people, like Jan from Clan William, and there's people from all over the country. If somebody here is going, Arno, how do I create a smart city, community, village where I'm at? What's the next step?
You start with the core people in your community. With other words, those who are kingdom-minded, and also there must be some from the business community, some from the schools, some from NGOs, the churches side, key role players in a community that are kingdom-minded. And you start working on a master plan for that community. With other words, what would you like to see change? The moment you start working on that, it creates a platform to say, okay, what is the alternative? I mean, this community exists, but what alternative, biblical, godly alternatives can we bring into this community that will solve some of these issues? And that's where the process gets started. It always is a core group in a neighborhood or a town or a community that starts coming together. It's like Oasis, and you start it on a micro scale, and it grows literally. And then that the rest of the community becomes so impressed with that's happening there. They say, we want to be part of this. That's how resource economies are, for instance, built. Overseas, you've got lots of examples where people start saying, listen, let's set up like a big place where we can store resources. I only need this or that once or twice a week. If I don't use it, I can leave it there. And then there's a whole system to control the stock and where it goes and when it comes back, and you create these Joseph storehouses in communities, because that is, that's what suddenly the people in the community respond, even non-Christians, and say, but listen, this is how we care about each other. And even without the business models and all of that happening, just by starting with a resource sharing economy, you can build capacity. And you would be amazed at how much people would actually want to start contributing. There are markets overseas, I've seen in England as well, where they just say, let's get a Saturday and we bring everything that's extra in your house. Just take it there. It's being sold for very little, and that money is being pulled together, and then it builds capacity. It starts creating maybe 1 or 2 projects where it creates jobs for people in the community. So that's a way where you don't always have to pay, but you can share. And the whole sharing creates access. And that's what we want to do, access for people in the community. Of course, but that core group of leaders is important because it needs to be well stewarded, well stewarded. Because if there's a mistake there, it kind of, the integrity of the whole operation suffers.
So Arno, we're 1 o'clock. Again, thank you for your time. Assuming there's this core group of local elders, men and women that are trusted in the community, and they're saying we want to do this, is there a place they can access resources, help? Is there someone who can advise them in this process?
Yeah, you know what? We're actually starting an initiative called Project SA, which has exactly this purpose. A network of experts and a network of people that are pooling funds together, that's building an economic arc for South Africa. It's still a bit under the radar, but we're working on that. So resources and skills. And then we want to make sure that people go there. So the website's name is, if you want to visit there, just to make it concrete, is Project SA, one word, .solutions. That's the website. So it's www.projectsa.solutions. And through that's an angle. And the whole idea with that is that we collaborate, that we reinforce the Kingdom initiatives that's already there, but we need to build bridges because we operate in isolation. And the network model is collaborative. We need to work towards the same ends. And I believe that's what God is doing. And that's the heart of Africa.
Arno, thank you so much. I just can't thank you enough.